This is the second piece of subscriber content, and this time I'm going to be reading out a piece by Vladimir Milov where he's in conversation with Michael Naki. This was recorded on the 8th of June 2024, and the title is "What Will China Give to Putin?" And the subject matter here is essentially how Russia has become a vassal state of China and what direction that relationship is turning. Here I have transcribed and translated the words of Vladimir Milov, who tries to explain the situation. What did Putin agree with Xi Jinping during his visit to China? And what is happening in Russian-Chinese relations in general? There is a lot of talk about this now. On the one hand, the dialogue between Putin and Xi in Beijing did not end with anything concrete in terms of signing any new agreements. On the other hand, we hear a lot of talk that China may still begin to supply Russia with lethal weapons for use in its war with Ukraine. In general, what is the current situation in Russian-Chinese relations, since despite all these statements about eternal friendship, some rather alarming messages are coming through? Agreements between the countries are not working. Large Chinese companies have stopped working with Russia, fearing secondary US sanctions. This video is from Vladimir Milov's channel, where he periodically provides similar updates for viewers about what is really happening between Russia and China, clearing away all the propaganda husks and individual stories inflated by journalists with numbers, with facts. Well, you've got used to all of those. Now we will talk about all this seriously and in detail with the propaganda stripped away. Well, first of all, it must be said that despite the fact that Russian propaganda presented Putin's visit to China with maximum fanfare, and, by the way, most of the Russian government and senior people from the Russian leadership went with him, but on the other hand, the results of this visit were strikingly empty. As a result, Putin and Xi signed only 11 documents. You can easily find this list on the Kremlin's website, and it's clear that there is nothing serious there. No new financial, trade, or military agreements, only phytosanitary protocols, which in general can be signed at the level of deputy ministers. And the rule of Russia does not have to go to China for this. At the same time, there is a lot of news that, for example, the problem of frozen payments is raging between Russia and China. Chinese banks and Chinese companies refuse to work with their Russian counterparts. A very large number of agreements are blocked. For example, payments for Chinese electronics up to 80%. This is, in principle, a very serious threat. In fact, it's resulting in the shutdown of many Russian production facilities, which are heavily dependent on Chinese electronics. Or there's other news that large Chinese players, right after this visit, suddenly began to leave the Russian market. For example, this is what the largest supplier of video surveillance systems did. Siemens, who simply, without telling anyone at all, withdrew, closed their production site, removed their staff, and left Russia. More serious news with Russia is that one of the largest Chinese companies, Alibaba Group, has stopped working in the country, and this will seriously hit wholesale buyers who bought goods from China through it. Well, there's immediately a bit of a misunderstanding here, because many media outlets wrote that the owner of AliExpress had stopped working with Russia. But in fact, AliExpress is a subsidiary of Alibaba, and that continues to work with Russia, although wholesalers will still be dealt a very serious blow. But it may be premature to relax about this, because the media also reported that Alibaba and other investors who own AliExpress, its branch in Russia, have very sharply reduced staff levels and stopped investing in the development of AliExpress in Russia. And here's some more alarming news. In the first months of this year, China quite significantly, by about 10%, reduced exports to Russia of all kinds of sophisticated products, including equipment, machines for production, components for various industries, as well as for the military. And as we know, today Russian industry cannot produce many things, including complex equipment. It's highly dependent on these supplies from China. In April, industrial production in Russia slowed down significantly. I believe this is due to the ceasing of imports of many complex industrial components and technologies from China. And in general, there is no alternative sources for them. Chinese suppliers are shutting down en masse in Russia due to the threat of American secondary sanctions. In addition, the problem of unblocking payments is not being resolved. The situation here is that Chinese banks are very dependent on integration into the international financial system. The so-called countries of the global south, or BRICS, do not have any alternative financial system. And if you want to work with the international financial system, you will have to use the services of Western financial institutions. And this is a very weak and vulnerable link for Russia. We see that Putin's visit to China simply did not help resolve this whole tangle of problems. Note that in the end, more than 2 years have passed since the start of Putin's full-scale war against Ukraine, and Russia has received no investment, no technology, no loans from China. And it's having enormous problems just breaking through and gaining access to the Chinese market. Let me emphasize once again that in this sense, there are no breakthroughs. None were achieved during Putin's visit to Beijing. Also, for serious agricultural products, such as Russian grains, there is no breakthrough. China buys small quantities of Russian spring wheat and spring barley, but the most important product in terms of scale that Russia would like to supply to the Chinese market is winter wheat and barley. And there are no breakthroughs here. China has not yet given its consent to import these products from China. Kirill Babayev, director of the Institute of China and of the Russian Academy of Sciences, recently had an interview with Kommersant, and this phrase around no consent was even included in the headline. In the economic sphere, there are still many more problems between Russia and China than achievements. At the same time, Mr. Babayev is actually such an active evangelist of Russian-Chinese cooperation and who waxes lyrical about how good everything really is there. But even here, he admitted that indeed, so far, we don't see any economic success on the horizon. And it's not very clear in general what kind of cooperation with China is actually happening and what benefits it actually brings to Russia. There is, however, another side to the issue. On the contrary, Chinese goods, finished products, have flooded the Russian market. And this creates serious tension and problems for Russian manufacturers who cannot compete with them. That is, the influx of Chinese goods threatens and limits the development of Russia's own production, which Russian officials have already begun to talk about openly. Recently, there was the example of how the head of Avtovaz, Maxim Sokolov, simply attacked the Chinese, saying that they have an unfair pricing policy and are pushing Russian automakers out of the market. But here, even heavier artillery came into play. There was an interview with probably the largest Russian oligarch and the head of the military-industrial conglomerate Rostec, Sergei Chemezov, who in fact today has become the main beneficiary of the war. So Chemezov gave a long interview where he was also asked about this problem. Are Chinese competitors hampering Russian automakers? And in general, he said yes, they interfere, and that it is impossible to continue without protective measures against Chinese automakers on the Russian market. Get your popcorn ready, because it will be very, very interesting if Russia begins to introduce restrictive measures against Chinese suppliers. I think you understand how China will respond to this. We hear all this talk on Russian TV about eternal brotherly friendship and record levels of trade and cooperation, but in fact, Russian officials have said off the record that Russia is, by and large, on the verge of at least a small trade war with China, and maybe a big one, judging by the concerns of Russian manufacturers. And Prime Minister Mishustin, who recently traveled to Nizhny Novgorod, was shown a new Volga car models in a factory there. He was indignant at the fact that there was a Chinese steering wheel and Chinese components, and he called for all of this to be localized and for Russia to refuse to buy Chinese components. But there's more. Major Chinese players are stopping working with Russia. Our goods are not allowed into the Chinese market, and Russian officials, too, can no longer contain their dissatisfaction with the fact that Chinese products actively prevent them from developing their own production. These are the storm clouds that are gathering. This is all very, very different from the blissful picture of friendship and cooperation that is shown on TV. Let's talk a few words about why this is happening and why, in general, China turns its back on Russia and is not very keen to get it out of the difficult situation in which the Russian economy finds itself. We have already said in previous videos that for China, in fact, the scale of cooperation with Russia is insignificant. Russia accounts for only 4% of Chinese trade turnover, and Russia does not have any huge market for Chinese products. Russia is insignificant, incomparable with, of course, such large markets as the USA and Europe. Yes, therefore, here China has very limited interest in cooperation with its so-called partner. Basically, it is interested in buying raw materials at bargain prices with huge discounts. We see messages all the time that discounts for Gazprom are growing and that Gazprom showed a loss for the first time in 25 years because China has now become the largest buyer of Russian pipeline gas. And supplies to China, as we now actually see, are still unprofitable, as we expected. And now this is actually confirmed by the reporting of Gazprom. And that includes coal mines as well, whose profits fell by 81% in the first months of the year, because now all coal exports are focused primarily on China. And coal is sold there at huge discounts. It turns out that it is not at all profitable to trade coal with China. The profit from this is absolutely tiny. It is clear that apart from being a supplier of cheap raw materials at discounts, China is not particularly interested in Russia. And they are not very interested in Russia as a sales market either, because after all, the Russian economy is quite small in scale, and the population of Russia is poor. That's why Chinese companies, banks, find it easy to refuse to work with Russia, again, because they are afraid of secondary sanctions that will deny them access to much more attractive markets of Western countries. In fact, this is what former Russian Finance Minister Mikhail Zadornov said, who recently gave an interview to an investment channel, that Russia actually has a thrombosis in its system of financial settlements for foreign trade transactions, and that it needs to be treated very seriously. But in fact, the main reason here is that the banks of the so-called friendly countries, well, primarily we're talking about China, which in general do not really show any serious will to create a parallel system of financial settlements with Russia. For them, of course, working with the West is more interesting, and of course, the risk of Western secondary sanctions that we mentioned is far more terrible. It's the same with Turkish banks, Chinese banks. They could make settlements in yuan or settlements in Turkish lira, since these are not American dollars or euros, but they don't want to take the risks. They don't risk making such calculations, even in non-hard currencies, just once again for fear of ending up on the sanctions list. A paired system, or simply a circulatory system of mutual payments, is required, but it's very difficult to build this kind of system from scratch. That is, it's being built, but this takes time, firstly, and secondly, it requires goodwill on the other side, and not just of individual banks, but of the governments of the National Bank of China, the National Bank of Turkey, and of course, the National Bank of India as well. And they, frankly speaking, do not show such a great desire to quickly establish relations. That is, to create some kind of alternative payment system. Well, why? Well, again, because there is a certain political pressure on them, and there is, on the Russian side, an illusion that these countries are just ready to take risks and build some kind of individual payment system from Russia. No, they also pursue a very cautious policy. That is the reality. Well, if we metaphorically formulate what is happening here, if we believe that the system of settlements with friendly countries, let's call it that, with those who do not apply sanctions is like a human body, then this body has a thrombosis. That is, it has developed blood clots in all of the main vessels. Of course, this is a very important and interesting point. In this year, 2024, the phenomenon began to appear for the first time after the start of the full-scale war with Ukraine. Western goods left the Russian market and Chinese goods poured into it en masse. But this began to cause open irritation amongst Russian officials. Mishustin, Chemyza, Sokolov, who directly said that the influx of everything Chinese seriously threatened the development of Russian production, and all of this will collide at one point somewhere. And it's also clear that the new Chinese imports are expensive. They're not cheaper than the previous Western imports. For example, the high cost of Russian cars. But here's what even the official Rosstat statisticians tell us on this topic. From the beginning of 2022 to the present day, the average price of an imported car has increased by 80% due to the fact that Russia has switched to importing almost entirely only Chinese cars. This is, in fact, a very interesting situation. Gas is at a discount, but Russia buys Chinese cars at a premium. All this hinders the development of Russian production. At the same time, China in general very easily betrays its Russian partners and blocks payments with them. Chinese companies look down on Russia as, in general, a partner in a secondary tier market. Why then did Putin go to China against this negative backdrop and the huge accumulation of problems? Indeed, several absolutely worthless documents were signed there. At the same time, Putin bought his entire entourage, almost the entire composition of the cabinet of ministers, all of his top leadership. But nevertheless, none of these raging problems were resolved. They all sat there, drank tea, and ate duck. But at the same time, problems with blocking payments were rampant. Large Chinese companies are leaving the Russian market. Chinese industrial exports to Russia are sharply declining. What is stopping our industry from working? Gazprom is at a loss, and so on. On this topic, not only has there been no breakthrough, but in general, not even some constructive words have been said. Putin, in fact, brushes the whole matter aside. And to add to this, recently information has appeared that Chinese banks are stopping accepting payments from Russian banks. What is happening? Well, there are two versions of what could really be happening. And the first of them, and many people say this, is the fact that the main discussion with China of these serious problems took place behind closed doors. And first of all, their priority actually concerned the supply of Chinese weapons to Russia. Indeed, this is very serious and an urgent need for Putin, because we are now receiving more and more news that Russia has serious problems with, first of all, military equipment and its production and repairs that do not cover the destruction of equipment at the front. Chinese products do appear, it's obvious, en masse, all sorts of outdated models of equipment. It's clear that Putin really needs Chinese weapons, and that is one of the explanations for what actually happened during Putin's visit to Beijing. There are phytosanitary protocols for cooperation, but this is official cover for the visit. But in fact, weapons were discussed and discussed behind closed doors. This is the theory. I'm convinced that China will not, however, give weapons to Putin, and for this reason. The whole point is that China has this so far unsolvable problem. That is the slowdown of the Chinese economy to record low growth levels. which are absolutely insufficient to maintain normal economic life there. China's entire economy has developed over the past 40 years to support these high rates of economic growth. And when they slow down, everyone simply begins to lack money and they begin to experience lower living standards. That's why in China, we saw these mass protests for the first time in many years. And the Chinese Communist Party is failing to do anything to improve the economy. The latest economic data is very, very weak. And here the fundamental question is that they need, as Western countries during the COVID crisis, they need to inject money into the economy, government aid, in order to revive it. That could amount to billions, if not trillions of dollars. But they don't want to do this, and they won't because they already have very high debt. If you don't just take the debt of the central authorities into account, but you also look at the debt of the regions, municipalities, and the private sector, then it is approaching 300% of GDP. Therefore, the Chinese do not want to destroy the last bastion of macro financial stability. They do not want to sharply inflate the national debt. In this situation, it is critical for them to continue to have access to Western markets. Where do all these Chinese products go? Well, of course, they go there. And here in the West, voices are increasingly being heard that since China is helping Russia, it is supplying a lot of dual-use products, from chips to helmets and body armor. In the West, there are very strong voices of hawks who say that China is helping Russia wage an aggressive war in Ukraine, that it is necessary to introduce economic restrictions and trade barriers against it. This is exactly what China does not need at all against the backdrop of sharp economic slowdown. If Western countries now start a real trade war against China because of military support of Russia, then this slowdown will lead directly to a huge decline in the economy and a decline in China's GDP. Xi Jinping remembers the recent mass protests in China, and of course he does not want this at all. Therefore, he continues to pursue this policy of appeasing Western countries to the maximum, in particular, first of all, with Europe, which has not yet declared trade wars against China, unlike America. This is exactly what Xi Jinping's recent visit to the European Union and meetings with Emmanuel Macron and so on were dedicated to. He wants to emphasize in every possible way that China is committed to continuing mutually beneficial economic cooperation with Europe and to extinguish all these voices of hawks who say that we need to introduce some kind of trade restrictive measures against China. But I think that Xi Jinping understands perfectly well that as soon as the West sees that China has begun supplying non-dual use products, but weapons to Putin in order for Chinese weapons to be used in Ukraine, then all these hawks who propose to introduce trade restrictions against China, various restrictive measures, they will, of course, rear their heads up sharply. Most likely, they will then be able to apply these measures, and China will be largely deprived of access to Western markets and, crucially, to the European market. This will hit the Chinese economy very hard. Therefore, I personally believe that Xi Jinping will not supply any weapons to Putin. Perhaps even under the threat of these sanctions and trade protectionist measures, China will even reduce the supply of dual-use products. But in general, by the way, Chinese companies and banks behave towards Russia, stopping their deliveries, stopping payments. It is clear from this behavior that they are still afraid of the West. They feel strongly dependent on Western markets and the Western financial system. It seems to me that against the background of all this, it would be very unrealistic to assume the supply of weapons. But besides this behind-the-scenes version about weapons, there is a second, in my opinion, much more prosaic and simpler story that explains why Putin's visit to Beijing turned out to be so empty. China simply no longer seriously looks at Russia as a comparable partner and simply wipes its feet on it. He doesn't even consider it necessary to reciprocate with the visit of Putin, who brought his entire entourage there. China simply does not consider it necessary to make even the smallest of concessions. Russia today is as weakened as possible and completely dependent on China. Without China today, the Putin regime would collapse. Without China, Putin can't do anything. And China understands this very well and behaves quite brazenly in this regard. Putin will continue to run to Beijing constantly in order to beg for more and new solutions that could ease the pressure and improve the economic situation of Russia. But China does not consider it necessary to do this because Western markets are more important to it. And Russia has, in fact, become a northern Chinese colony anyway. Right now, the majority of tourists who come to Russia are tourists from China. We see signs in Chinese everywhere in Russian cities. Even Russian officials begin to actively speak Chinese. Life forces you to learn the master's language, and we see images like this more and more often. Thus, the events of recent months, they practically destroy the entire picture that Russian propaganda tried to paint about the global Russia-Chinese partnership against the West. In words, there is a partnership, but in fact, China is reducing supplies of critical components and equipment to Russia. Chinese companies are leaving the Russian market. The problem of blocked payments, which for many Russian players and importers has simply become critical, is not being resolved in any way. And Putin's visit to China could not solve all of these hot and knotty problems in any case, because Xi Jinping already looks down on Putin. This visit of Putin to Beijing has already formalized the status of Russia as a northern protectorate of China. Putin is in an obviously subordinate position. This is not the first time, after all, that he has come to China. For China, the West is more important, America is more important, Europe is more important. China is simply wiping its feet on Russia. This whole policy of making Russia so critically dependent on China will not end well for Russia. China is extremely pragmatic. It is in no way interested in developing Russia. It is not interested in Russia becoming a competitor, its competitor in the international goods market. Therefore, why give them critical technologies? Why invest in them? China has not done and does not intend to do this. China, obviously, with its pragmatism, looks towards the West with much more enthusiasm. It needs Russia only as a supplier of cheap raw materials, while these problems will only get worse, because Putin has chosen the strategy of positioning Russia as a weakening player that is losing more weight and more influence by the day. This slowdown in China's economy is the worst in 40 years of economic growth. This is a sign of a very serious systemic crisis that will continue to engulf China. Big problems await in the future. What this means is that China has no incentive to spend its resources on Russia. China has no motive to allow Russian goods into its markets. Of course, it will give priority to its producers. China has every motive to look, first of all, at the priority of continuing cooperation of the West, because the main markets are there. The main capital comes from there. The financial architecture of the world is primarily geared towards Western countries. China is not interested in and does not need Russia. And this is a weakening player with a huge number of internal problems that will continue to grow. But I want people to see this convex alternative picture, what is behind the fanfare and the cheerful tone of Russian propaganda, which describes the successes of the Russian-Chinese cooperation. But in fact, the real situation there is getting worse. The so-called partnership with China does not bring any benefits to Russia, making itself dependent on China. Putin has created a huge number of problems for Russia in the future, which will only get worse and worse. History is cruel, and history will judge these decisions.